Single dad quit his job and left the city. 3 days later, the CEO found him living in a tiny apartment. 3 days after Daniel walked away from the company without asking for a single dollar, CEO Amelia Carter stood outside a tiny apartment with peeling paint, a broken hallway light, and a grocery bag hanging from her hand. She had spent 3 days searching for the quiet single dad who had suddenly resigned, left the city, and disappeared without explaining why. But she never expected to find him living in a cramped room with his 8-year-old daughter, counting coins on a kitchen table just to decide whether they could afford dinner. Daniel had always been the employee nobody noticed until something went wrong. He arrived early, stayed late, and never complained. At 36, he was raising his daughter Lily alone after losing his wife several years earlier. He worked as a logistics supervisor at Carter Industries, a company known for its polished offices, expensive cars, and ruthless deadlines. Daniel's clothes were always clean but simple, his lunch was usually packed from home, and his old sedan had a habit of making strange noises every morning. Yet he carried himself with quiet dignity because Lily was watching him, and he wanted her to believe that even difficult days could be survived with honesty. If you believe kindness can change someone's life and that everyone deserves a second chance, take a moment to like this story, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to SoulTales. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories of kindness, courage, and second chances. The trouble began on a rainy Monday morning when Daniel was called into a meeting with Amelia. She had recently discovered that one of the company's largest shipments had been delayed, costing the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. The board wanted someone blamed immediately, and Daniel's department was at the center of the investigation. Daniel tried to explain that the shipment had been redirected because a supplier had falsified documents, but nobody seemed interested in hearing the entire story. Amelia, exhausted from weeks of pressure, believed the reports placed responsibility on Daniel's team. She didn't insult him, but her disappointment was enough to break something inside him. Daniel simply placed his resignation letter on the desk. Amelia stared at it, confused. Daniel had worked there for nearly 9 years. He had been one of the most dependable people in the company, and yet he was leaving without negotiating severance, compensation, or even another job. What she didn't know was that Daniel had received devastating news that morning. Lily's school had informed him that her scholarship had been cancelled because of a paperwork issue. At the same time, the landlord had given him a final notice on their apartment. Daniel had been trying to hold everything together for months, secretly working overtime while pretending to Lily that everything was fine. He didn't leave because he hated the company. He left because he was tired of coming home too exhausted to hear his daughter's stories. That evening, Daniel drove out of the city with Lily asleep in the back seat. Their belongings fit into 6 boxes and 2 old suitcases. He had no new job waiting, no savings worth mentioning, and no clear plan beyond finding somewhere cheap enough to start again. Lily woke just before sunrise and asked where they were going. Daniel smiled through the fear in his eyes and told her they were going somewhere they could breathe. 3 days passed. Amelia couldn't forget the resignation. Something about Daniel's silence bothered her. She reopened the shipment investigation and discovered that the report she had relied upon was incomplete. Daniel hadn't caused the loss. In fact, he had warned management about the supplier almost 2 weeks earlier. Someone above him had ignored the warning and then altered the internal records to protect themselves. Amelia felt a cold wave of guilt. She ordered her assistant to find Daniel. The address they eventually uncovered wasn't a new house or a comfortable apartment. It was a tiny rented room in an aging residential building nearly 2 hours outside the city. Amelia drove there herself. When Daniel opened the door, he looked nothing like the composed supervisor she remembered. His beard had grown out, his shirt was faded, and exhaustion showed beneath his eyes. Behind him was a small room containing a second-hand table, 2 chairs, a narrow mattress, and a little girl's drawings taped to the wall. Lily sat on the floor doing homework beside a small electric heater. Amelia didn't know what to say. Then she noticed the kitchen counter. There were only a few potatoes, half a loaf of bread, and a small carton of milk. Daniel immediately looked embarrassed and tried to explain that things were temporary. But Amelia wasn't listening anymore. She was looking at Lily's schoolbooks. One of them was held together with tape. For the first time, Amelia understood that the man she had judged as an employee had been fighting an entirely different battle. Daniel finally admitted that he had resigned because he couldn't keep sacrificing his daughter for a job. Every night he returned home too late to help Lily with homework. Every weekend he promised they would spend time together, only to receive another emergency call from the office. He had spent years trying to provide a better life for her, but somewhere along the way, he realized he was giving her money while losing the moments she actually needed. Amelia felt ashamed. She remembered every time she had asked Daniel to stay late. Every weekend email. Every urgent meeting. She remembered seeing Lily waiting in the company lobby once, holding a small drawing for her father while Daniel finished a report. Amelia had barely noticed the child then. Now she couldn't stop thinking about that picture. But there was something else Amelia hadn't yet discovered. On the tiny table sat an old envelope. Inside was a letter Daniel had written before leaving the city. It wasn't a resignation complaint. It wasn't an angry accusation. It was a thank you letter to Amelia. Daniel had written that despite everything, the company had once given him the opportunity to provide for Lily after his wife died. He didn't want to leave with hatred in his heart. He simply wanted to become a father again. Amelia read the letter in silence, and tears filled her eyes. The next morning, she returned to the company and ordered a complete investigation into the shipment scandal. The employee who had manipulated the records was eventually exposed. Daniel's name was cleared publicly, but Amelia knew an apology wasn't enough. She offered Daniel his old position back, but he refused. Instead, she offered him something completely different. A flexible management position that allowed him to work remotely most of the week, a proper salary, and a scholarship fund for Lily's education. Amelia also created a new company policy allowing parents with children to have flexible schedules without being treated as less committed employees. Daniel accepted the job, but only after making one condition: he wanted the policy available to every parent in the company, not just him. Amelia agreed. Months later, Daniel and Lily moved into a small but comfortable home near the school. It wasn't a mansion. Daniel still drove his old car. Lily still loved drawing pictures at the kitchen table. But now her father was home for dinner most nights. One evening, Amelia visited them and found Lily running toward her with a drawing. It showed 3 people standing beneath a bright yellow sun. Daniel looked at it and smiled. Lily had drawn her father, herself, and Amelia. Amelia held the picture against her chest, realizing that sometimes the people we think are leaving us are actually showing us something we desperately needed to see. Daniel had quit his job to save his relationship with his daughter. Instead, his courage had changed an entire company. And Amelia, the CEO who once measured people's worth by deadlines and results, had finally learned that a person's greatest success isn't always found in an office. Sometimes it's found at a tiny kitchen table, beside a child who simply wants their father to come home. If this story touched your heart, please don't just watch and scroll away. Like the video, share it with someone who believes people deserve kindness, and subscribe to SoulTales for more stories about hope, family, kindness, and second chances. And before we end, I have one special request: comment "second chances" below if you believe one act of understanding can completely change someone's life. Because Daniel thought leaving the city meant he had failed. But sometimes walking away from the life that is breaking you is the first step toward finding the life you were meant to live. And sometimes, the person who follows you into your darkest moment isn't there to judge you. They're there to remind you that you were never truly alone.